Egg prices have skyrocketed since President Trump took office. So what specifically is he doing to lower those costs for Americans?
Really glad you brought this up. The Biden administration and the Department of Agriculture directed the mass killing of more than 100 million chickens, which has led to a lack of chicken supply in this country, therefore a lack of egg supply, which is leading to the shortage.
Is this true? Is there validity to this that Biden ordered the mass killing of 100 million chickens?
Yeah, it's true that the slaughter of so many chickens is creating that shortage. And where the orders came down from, it kind of depends upon how you look at it. But I think what she's pointing to is the fact that the federal government has a hand in how are we containing this bird flu crisis. And here's the reality: the bird flu crisis is very much the cause of our egg shortage. There's something deeper as well, and this is something that it hasn't really been acknowledged by the media. It hasn't been explored or probed by the media, which is why I'm glad you're asking about this, because everything that's going on is that we have these highly integrated industries that are delivering our food, the food that goes from the farm gate to the dinner table. They're highly integrated. So like a lot of industries in this country, they're dominated by a small number of very large players. And so when that happens, you have a great big distribution center or a great big processing facility or a larger farm that goes down because they have to euthanize their chickens, either because there's an infection and their vets are telling them veterinarians saying, hey, you got to do this, or because the government is saying, hey, slaughter those chickens rightly or wrongly. What happens is when you have a really big facility go down, that has a huge impact on our supply. If we had a world that had more small family farms providing more eggs and other products locally and regionally, in addition to our national food supply chain, this wouldn't affect us so much. If we had the ability for the small American farmer to deliver more crops and products to people locally and have people know where their food comes from, we would have a world where, bird flu is going to affect, some of the bird population, but it doesn't have to wipe out as many chickens as it has. Whether they ought to have been wiped out or not, we don't have to have it that way. If we were to have the small family farmer be a bigger part of this solution.
Right. So how frequently does something like that happen where the government just comes out and says, yeah, you have to take out this many animals from these areas for this reason? Is that like a rare thing? Is that something that happens all the time? And like, who's deciding that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know how much is going to happen going forward. We'll see, if they change their practices and what else the Trump administration decides to do about that. But it's actually it's happened a fair amount in our history. Another really big example was during COVID, when, not only chickens, but there was produce going to rot. There was milk being dumped. What was happening in that case is that our supply chain was being restricted, disrupted, because you'd have, say, a great big processing center for food or a big, trucking center go down because of a COVID infection. And again, you can have the debate around whether the infection is what drove that disruption or whether the government's reaction, like local governments and state governments in some places shutting things down in a big way. You can argue about those individual decisions, but whether it's the infection of COVID or whether it was the reaction to that by local and state governments, we had the supply chain disrupted then too. And it happens off and on throughout our history. So this shows the risks to our food supply. We have a real food security issue where we have a food system that's a modern miracle, delivering food in all parts of the country, all times of the year, anything you can imagine. But it's very vulnerable to these disruptions because it's so integrated. We don't have enough small businesses in all these different sectors delivering food in all kinds of different ways. It's too easy to kind of choke off our supply in this country.
So it's gotten very centralized is what you're saying. It sounds like, right?
Exactly.
So that brings up something that I've always been very interested in. I watched a documentary called What the Health, and it was about these journalists who kind of show what the big ag or like the agricultural industrial complex is like. And, it shows like these large scale slaughterhouses where they got the, cows cramped in together. They're injecting them with antibiotics, all that nasty stuff. And I guess in 2006, they came out with this law called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which basically establishes or classifies you as a terrorist if you do something that could be potentially economically damaging to one of these companies. So, it's like it was said to be done because of, animal rights activists and whatnot. But I don't know, like how nasty is this industry? And the fact that we can't really have journalists go in and like look at it and do exposés on it, that's a little bit weird and a little bit unique because, even something as powerful as the military industrial complex or big pharma, they don't have those things in place where if you do an expose on it, you're classified as a terrorist.
Yeah. You know, the situation that we're in this country is that we do have a small number of large farms providing a lot of the food in our country. The thing that people don't talk about a lot is why is that? What's the deeper systemic reason for that? And what it
Mhm.
comes down to is that our government has not looked out for the little guy. Our government has not made sure that there are fair markets domestically here inside the United States and internationally with global trade. Our government hasn't made sure that there are fair markets for the little guy, for the average family farmer or small business on Main Street to be able to compete. It's been big government and big business that we've been rushing toward. And so what you see with larger farms, to be honest, is you've got farms that are trying to keep up with the larger agribusiness companies. You got the agribusiness
Mhm.
companies trying to keep up with the larger food companies. And those big food companies are trying to keep up with the big business in all of the other industries all across the American economy. And so we wrestle with this in the book. We talk about the fact that like larger and larger farms do create pressure on small farms and lead to that consolidation that wipes them out. And there are challenges with larger farms. We also talk about the fact that a lot of those farms got bigger trying to survive the same challenges that other farms are. They're trying to find a way to get economic scale to be able to survive. And part of that is because they're chasing the ag companies that are chasing the food companies that are chasing companies in all the rest of our economy. So the reality is that we can look at the farmers, the bigger ones, but we also have to acknowledge that they're trying to survive in an economy that's dominated by big. And we have to ask ourselves,
Mhm.
what are we going to do about the fact that our economy is dominated by big all across the American economy?
Wow. So, would you say that there's a certain turning point in the last 100 years or so where it pivoted from an industry that's dominated by small family farmers to these big, giant corporate agricultural things? Like a lot of these times, the governments will put things, policies in place, like whether we've seen with the banking sector, we've seen with the military industrial complex that just, I don't know whether it's intentional, probably intentional or unintentional, just stupidity, but they put policies in place that end up crushing the smaller guys, and then the bigger guys, absorb them and become these big giant entities that like the whole system runs through. Was there like a turning point that happened with that with your industry?
It's such a great question. In my book, Land Rich Cash Poor, we go through the hidden areas of history driving the disappearance of our family farms, and we weave that with my family's story, surviving from the Depression to today. And I looked at that exact issue, and it was in the Great Depression that we had this big government intervention into agriculture, and that
Mm.
is around the time that we also started having a lot of farms wiped out. A lot of farms were wiped out by the Depression and the economic crisis, but also the government got involved and maybe saved some farms, but also created some real problems and unintended consequences, or as you said, maybe some policymakers who didn't care and wanted to just kind of have control.
Right,
What
right.
ended up happening is as we came out of the Depression and we came out of that economic crisis wiping out farms, we came into the 1950s, and that really began an era where the American economy began to be dominated by big in a much bigger way.
Mhm.
Bigger government, bigger business that was needed to be able to meet the demands of government. And so we started to have industry after industry begin to be dominated by bigger and bigger companies. And so the 1950s is really when your average small American family farm began to run into the whole idea that our economy was dominated by big. And that has continued every decade since through economic crisis and through times of prosperity. And in fact, in the 1950s was one of the most severe times in terms of farms being wiped out. It was like, even though it was a really good economic time, right? People remember that as they recovered from the Great Depression, post
Yeah.
World War II. This is like economic prosperity for America. And it was. But we lost like 22% of our farms in just a 5-year period
Wow.
because of moving into this world where we decided our whole economy, not just agriculture, our whole economy was going to be dominated by big. So the agriculture economy had to keep up, and we lost a lot of farms along the way.
So what's the situation where like it's an interesting industry where you don't hear a lot of industries that have to be subsidized to the degree that farmers do, or like I've heard the government has to pay farmers to destroy crops to keep prices at a certain level, where most industries you're trying to make the product as cheap as possible, but in this industry if the product gets to a certain level then it could wipe people out if it gets low enough, right?
Yeah, so the destruction, other than when you've got like when there was bird flu and other things, when there was deliberate destruction, they say to contain a disease. The time where
Mhm.
they really were paying farmers to destroy crops was really in the Great Depression. And they were
Mm.
plowing under crops, they were destroying crops, and they were trying to bring the supply down to increase the price for farmers. It's all kinds of government efforts to
Wow.
manipulate things. By the way, it was happening at a time when Americans were starving. We were destroying food at a time that Americans were starving, right? Incredible.
Yeah.
Reads like a dystopian novel. But
Yeah.
what has happened in the years since is after you had that government intervention, it's like Ronald Reagan said, you know, the closest thing to eternal life on this earth is a government program. Once you start it, it's very hard to get people to withdraw it. And so that has just continued and continued. And the situation we have with farmers now is this: taxpayers are rightly asking, where's our money going? What's it doing? And then small family farmers are saying, where's this support that's supposed to be out there? You know, whether it's right or wrong, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, the support is supposed to be going to family farms. And it really isn't having the impact it's supposed to have. Why is that happening? It's because the federal government is so ineffective. For decade after decade, they've been piling program upon program. So we don't know if they're working right anymore because they've just been piled on top of one another. Number one. Number two, they can often be contradictory to one another. One program goes this way, the other program is that way. And number three, over time, as you and your listeners know, government becomes prone to favoritism and abuse. People figure out how to take advantage, right? So it's fraud.
Mhm.
So all those reasons, our government programs aren't functioning right. So it's two things are true at once. Taxpayers are saying, where's our money going? And farmers are saying, hey, where's the support we're supposed to be receiving? A lot of that money goes to places that it shouldn't go to, people who invest in farmland just to kind of have it as a tax shelter. You know, your average hardworking family farmer that is finding it harder and harder to make a living each year isn't getting that support.
If you enjoyed the short clip, click right here to watch the full episode, and remember to subscribe to the channel. God bless.